I used to be ashamed of my past and unsure if I'd make it to where I was going. But I knew one thing was for certain. We don't end up where we're going on accident. I've also learned that we can't erase the past or hide from it, but we can learn from it and pass it on to others. So who am I? I'm the definition of a bootstrap girl. Someone who's made the hard choices to pick themselves back up and make something of themselves. And I'm not the only one. My name is Danisha. I'm a mom, a wife, a professor, advocate, queen of my own path, who's overcome abuse, foster care, homelessness, and raising 5 siblings on my own at the age of 24. And eventually I got a PhD. But something that I learned is that I don't know everything. So here on my show, we're going to be bringing in people who know the things that we don't know. Let's get in and learn on the Dr. Danisha Keating Show. Hey everybody, welcome back. I have the Davey with me. I'm so excited to finally get him on my podcast. Fun fact, 2 years ago, I was able to be on his Nothing is Wasted podcast, which you guys should all listen to. There's hundreds of episodes that are amazing on there. But I was able to be on there when I was pregnant with my daughter at like 16 or 17 weeks. And now she's almost 2 years old, which is insane. But Davey just launched his book, Nothing is Wasted, and it is grounded in a heartbreaking story, but there is just so much hope that I have watched come from Davey's story. And I mean, I wasn't there in the beginning, but reading through just chapter 1 left me like, oh my gosh. So we're going to be talking about grief. And it is one of those things that, before we started, I was telling Davey, I was like, look, I recognize that there's a lot of moments in our life where we're sitting with people and there's a lot of questions when it comes to grief because we are on either one, we're in it, or we're watching people on the other side of it. And so our answers might be a little bit different when we are trying to express that there's hope at the end of or in the middle of what we're going through. And so we're going to just jump in and talk about what grief is and some ways to look through. I know I work with a lot of former foster youth. Davey talks to so many different people about this particular topic that it feels like when someone's in their grief, it can be hard for somebody else who doesn't understand to sit with them. So share me with a little bit, like how you can share as much as you want or as little as you want. Yeah. But what did you experience and how did you recognize grief in your life and your situation and all that?
Yeah. Well, Danisha, thanks so much for having me on. I was just looking.
Absolutely.
It was episode 229 of the Nothing is Wasted podcast. So if anybody wants to fast reference that, it was an incredible conversation. As I recall, you were in a hotel room, weren't you?
I was at an event and I had just gotten, it was like one of my first events too that I started sharing my story at. And it was like, you were like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? And I was like, oh my gosh. And I was like, this is the first podcast I've ever been on. Oh my gosh. And I'm like, I looked back and I was like, oh, I stuttered. I did this. And you're like, hey, it's good. Like, that's part of it. And I'm like, oh,
you did
okay,
great.
Cool.
It was actually inspiration for me because after that, I bought a travel mic because prior to that, any speaking engagement that I had done, I'd be like, well, I can't record a podcast while I'm there. And then I'm like, I mean, there's time I'm sitting in the hotel and stuff, or I'm waiting. Like, I'm just sure. Yeah. Schedule it. And thanks for being an inspiration to me.
You're welcome.
Dr.
I didn't even know I did that. Didn't know I did that. That's awesome. Now I'm going to have a travel set because I didn't think about that.
Grief is one of those things that whether we want to recognize it or not, it visits all of us. We say Nothing is Wasted Ministries. Pain is the common denominator of life. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes people don't recognize that what follows on the coattails of pain is grief. And that's what we've got to recognize that because any kind of pain, suffering, trauma, tragedy in our life, it is a version of a loss. There's some kind of loss that is in the wake of that. And if we don't follow the pattern of or the pathway of grief, then we're going to stuff or we're going to bury or we're going to try to numb to or we're going to build maladaptive coping mechanisms for our grief. And then it's going to end up coming out sideways later. And it really affects the way that we show up for our family, the way we show up at work, the way we show up for the world, the way we show up in our relationships when we're carrying that grief. And so, for me, this was not a concept I recognized prior to 2015. I had a lot of passion around a lot of other things. I did love people. I was a pastor. I did love working with people. I loved seeing people come to know Jesus as their personal savior. I loved helping them step into their purpose. It's one of my favorite things to help people in is how are you designed? How are you built? And how does that lead you or inform you, give you kind of the coding for what you were meant to do in this world to make a difference? But I didn't recognize that pain is infused into that. Pain actually gives us passion, right? Which passion by virtue, by definition, means suffering, what you're willing to suffer for, and usually comes out of suffering. And that certainly was the case for me in 2015. I was a pastor and a church planter. I was married to my wife, Amanda. We just celebrated our 7-year August of that year. And we had one son who was 15 months old. We were expecting a daughter. She was 13 weeks along in her pregnancy. And then November 10th, my home was broken into, and Amanda was murdered in that home invasion. And so I lost Amanda, and I lost our unborn baby, Evie. She didn't pass away immediately, but she died from 3 gunshot wounds in the hospital 24 hours later. So it was very sudden. It was very tragic. It was very upending. It was unimaginable, very catastrophic. And overnight, I just lost my best friend, my ministry partner, my soulmate. I was now a single dad to Weston, trying to figure out how to wake up and walk through life and sort through it was very easy to recognize for me that this was grief, the agony, the despair, the anguish that I was feeling, but then also how to help others around me. I mean, we had this responsibility of this church that we had started, and, we had a congregation at the time of about 120, 150 people, and they were reeling with the grief of losing Amanda. And then immediately after that, I mean, it was about 6 months later, our congregation exploded from 150 to about 450, close to 500. Partially because I was talking about grief honestly from stage.
Yeah.
I was talking about pain.
Yeah.
I was talking about loss. And it was something that seemed novel to a lot of people. It wasn't something a lot of pastors talked about that openly and honestly, and wrestled with things, not giving resolve to that wrestling. And I think that kind of points us to the first thing that, you were referencing there. Like, it's hard for people to sit with people in grief and not try to solve or resolve their grief.
Oh, 100%. So there's so much to unpack with just that, where it's like you're watching Winston and he's 15 months, and that grief looks very different at 15 months compared to an adult, but there's still grief that's there.
Goodness, yes.
Then you're holding grief of your congregation, your family, her side of the family. And then you're still dealing with, like, okay, there's more than just, it's not just, you're not just grieving in this, you're taking care of funeral stuff, you're taking care of all this other stuff that there's sometimes what happens in grief. What we do is this is so hard for some, like I've seen it happen so many times where it's the person who's going through it is holding everybody else up. So did you find yourself in that, and how did you kind of step into, hey, I need to be held too?
Yeah. Yes and no. It's interesting that you mentioned that. Up until that point, my MO was to hold everybody else up. I had, my late wife used to say, Davey, you've got a savior complex. You've got to knock it off. Like, you cannot help everybody. And so that was my MO, was to try to okay, I'm going to try to help other people really step into the fullness of what God has called them to be. And so I would go in and rescue, and I would be guilty of enablement because of that a lot of times. And this was one of those situations, Danisha, that it was so upending that for the first time in my life, I immediately didn't feel the responsibility or need to help other people. It was like, and I can't quite explain it, but it was like one of those, it was like the first time in my life that I was like, I cannot do this. I literally hit that max overwhelm where I just could not help other people. And I was really grateful for the people around me who just stepped in, our church staff, our congregation, my family, who stepped in and really helped me in those seasons and gave me space and gave me the breath that I needed. There was no expectation for me to come back to start preaching. There was no expectation for me. I mean, this was so upending for all of us. This was a massive disruption in our entire story. Something that is so unexpected. I mean, here we are. There was nothing about the profile of our family that would say, oh yeah, there was a home invasion and broken it. And unfortunately, we tend to associate a lot of different, stereotypes to that kind of, I mean, so we didn't how in the world did we, this was nothing near what we would expect would happen in our life. And so I'm grateful for the fact that, I liken it. I don't know if you've heard Andy Kolber, Try Softer is the book that she wrote. She gave some really great language that we use often when we teach workshops, we share with people, that my type of tragedy, it would be called a big T tragedy. It would be as if you're going into an emergency room and you're an observer, you're just sitting there watching, and someone comes in and their limb is cut off, they are going to do everything they can to elevate that particular emergency to the top of the, like, they're going to get it. They're going to clear the way. They're going to get them a room. They're going to get blood transfused. Whatever they need to. It is acknowledged by everyone. This is an emergency. That was the case for me. That was the case for me. Everybody acknowledged this is an emergency.
So important, because I've seen the opposite happen sometimes, and I don't think it's intentional, but because there are times where people are not comfortable with sitting in grief, they're just like, well, she's not asking for help, or he's not asking for help. Right. And I find it is a lot easier for women to have this support than men. I know a lot of single dads, and a lot of like, just, it's so hard, and it breaks my heart, because a friend of mine is a single dad, and he's like, me asking for someone to mow my lawn, it feels like such a request, but some people, like, they're like, that's what you want? And he's like, I need help.
That's what I need. Yeah.
And it's like,
and yet it also feels like such an erosion of your own identity and your own manhood as a man. You're like, wait a minute, I can't ask for help.
And I was like, for you to be able to just be like, look, this is the big T. Like, this is where I'm just going to say what I need to say, but also be able to step in and say, we're just going to walk through this, and we're not going to hide it. We're not going to pretend. I find that that's what brings people closer together, is when we're like, no more BS. Like, there's no time for that, really. It's not even like you have to have a conversation. It's just a mutual understanding of like, hey, this isn't something that this person needs to ask for. We're just going to step in. So when you're speaking with your congregation and just talking and being honest about the grief, did you feel the shift happen where I mean, the growth exploded of like, hey, Pete, they're really talking about grief here. But was there a shift in how people sat with each other in the grief?
Yeah, I think that there was, because I was also able to experientially feel what it was like to have people come and tell me things that were well-intentioned but very unhelpful, things like, hey, at least you're young and you'll find love again. At least she's in a better place. I always tell people, hey, if you're going to start something with at least, in that moment, just
shush,
right? Don't say anything. And really, truly, don't say anything at all, because there's not anything that's going to come out of your mouth that's going to be helpful in that moment. What people need in those moments, especially in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy or a major loss like that, is they need you to just show up.
Yeah.
And they need practical help. The best things that people did for us is exactly what you just said, and this is just kind of by example, right? But just like mowing lawns or cleaning houses, or, gift cards for diapers, for food, for like those kinds of things that were super practical, that like I didn't know that I needed, but one day I'd wake up and I'd be like, oh crap, I don't have this. I need this right now. But it'd be there because someone had already preemptively given us that. But, and I don't want to diminish, or like, I don't want to offend anybody who sent these kinds of things, but like wind chimes and frames and that kind of stuff is just not, it's just not helpful, right? It's really not. It's a great
like, it's
sentiment,
loud and annoying.
but at the end of the day, I don't have any of those things still. I don't have any of those things. They just built clutter around, right? So the best thing is just be practical. We talk about the ministry of presence often. Just show up. This was actually an ancient Jewish practice called the sitting Shiva, where God told his people, hey, for 7 days, just go sit with them, cry with them, mourn with them. If you look in the book of Job, you see Job's friends for 7 days. They did a great job of doing this. After those 7 days, they tried to solve and resolve Job's pain. And this became very unhelpful to Job.
So I think sometimes people, the reason that they come in and say, well, at least, and I heard this so many times in my own story when I took my siblings in, or when I had a miscarriage, or just going through abuse, like still today when I share my story, people are like, well, at least, like at least, and I'm like, that is not a good way to start a sentence. But I think they are trying to offer a comfort, but then what it tends to turn in, and we see this in Job, where it's at first it's comforting in their behavior, and then it turns into like, well, did you do anything wrong? And I'm like,
yes, exactly.
No.
Let's try to find some explanation for this, right? Because we've got to, as human beings, we want to find some kind of rational explanation.
We need to explain it away. And that, because it's not something like, so I go into like murder mystery, like FBI mode, because, I've watched too many TV shows, but it's like, man, like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. And then there's going to be an investigation with what happened. And then there's going to be complete questions and all this other stuff. And the worst thing I can do to you is be like, hey, Davey, well, at least maybe just be like, man, what do you need? And you're like, I don't know. It's like, okay, well, you have a kid.
Sometimes you don't know.
You have a 15-month-old there. He's going to need clothes. He's going to need shoes,
Right.
probably going to need diapers. And that's someone just saying, okay, what did I need or need on a daily basis that we can help with versus verbal help. We don't need verbal help. That usually is, I think that some people are like, I don't have anything else to give. And I'm like, well, just give a hug and walk away. Not to sound rude, but it's like sometimes what we do is we actually, like you said, make the situation worse because we speak. And it's like, look, if you're good with words, cool. But that's when I have been hurt the most by people in my pain is like, well, at least, when we had our first miscarriage, we were 12 weeks and someone said, well, at least you were only 12 weeks and you didn't go full term. And I'm like, you don't know what that situation, like the whole, and I'm not going to get into detail, but it's like, you don't know what that moment was when I sat there and went through it. And then to be like, well, now it's your wife and your unborn baby. And it's, well, at least she's in heaven. And it's like, but that's not my plan.
That's not what I want her to be here.
That's not what we planned.
Yeah.
I wanted her next.
Exactly right.
Our plan was next to me having a second child. Like,
right.
And then, I keep going back. There's just this thing that we're going to talk about. It is, you guys moved to plant this church.
Mm-hmm.
And most people would say, like, okay, we're following God's plan. We did the big move, and then this horrible thing happens.
Right.
And you lean in to still doing the mission of what, like, you're like, this is what God called us to. Like, it's not you didn't pass it by and be like, okay, well, there's a reason. You're just like, this where I'm at. And this is where I find myself. What was going through your head? Like, to get back up and start speaking to your church, your friends and your family, to be like, we're just going to talk. Like, what was that like to be in that kind of mindset? Because my mindset in grief is to retreat versus yours is like, I'm here at this point pressing in. What was that? What went through your head with that?
Well, there was a lot of things that played into it, and you get to see the journey of that over the course of the book. Nothing is wasted, right? Like, you see how it wasn't something that I was like, as soon as it happened, okay, here's my strategy. Here's a manual for how to do this. It was God revealing those things through other people or through even Amanda's journals that I read afterwards. Like, it was one step at a time but every step that God invited me into was a step to lean in, not run away. Yeah. And I think that's what's most important about grief, is that the pathway out of the valley is through the valley. We have to lean in. And so initially for me, it was, a pastor, Levi Lesko, who reached out to me. He wrote the foreword of the book. He explained this concept to me. It was about a month after everything happened. And he was like, I want to walk with you in this. And he essentially explained, like, you've got to run toward the roar. So he had lost his daughter, 5-year-old daughter, died in his arms, an asthma attack. And so very tragic. And it was, he knew. So it was like, he could say things to me because he had been there. He had done that. This was not like someone coming up to me like, hey, I understand what you're going through. I just lost my cat last week, so let me give you some advice, right? This was someone who had been in the middle of the valley, similar story to mine, and he had street cred to be able to say, let me walk with you in this. So he really helped me understand that the triggers in our life, the things that are reminding us of the pain or the incident that has happened, we call that PTSD, right? We would get triggered by those things. That those are not villains to our story. They're actually invitations or indicators that we need deeper healing. So instead of running away from those triggers, we got to lean toward those triggers. We have to face them head on, because we're not going to heal from something we don't deal with. And we're not going to deal with anything we're not willing to feel. So I've got to feel it. I've got to feel the full...
Can you say that again?
Yeah. We're not going to heal from something we don't deal with. And we're not going to deal with anything that we don't feel. Dang. So we have to take the pathway of suffering fully, of lamenting, of actually grieving the loss of this, so that new life can come. And at every step of the way, I believe that God meets you in the middle of that grief and he breathes new life into it. So when I began to start running toward the roar, and there's several different accounts of that, one of which was going back into the house after 3 months. I hadn't gone back into the house because frankly, the whole idea of it haunted me. Yeah. But the only way I got rid of those images that were in my mind of walking into Find Amanda was confronting it, was exposure therapy, essentially, going back into the house and and dealing with it right there.
Yeah.
And so then, I felt really empowered. I felt like I had some agency. And what trauma tends to do is rob you from your sense of agency.
Yeah.
And so I felt like, wait a minute, okay, I may have been out of control of a lot of this situation, but God has given me some divine agency through the same spirit that raised Jesus from the dead. He lives inside of me, so I can walk with Jesus in this. And I'm going to respond to his invitations. And part of the invitation is I've got to take a faith step, and then he's going to show up. So for me, I felt like, okay, I got to get back to preaching. And that felt like a battle that felt like taking the battle in the spiritual. Like the enemy had punched in my life. And so now I need to punch back. Here's what I recognized early on. I recognized that this was more than just a natural thing. This was a spiritual thing. And all of our pain is really, because at the end of the day, we have a very real enemy. Ephesians 6 tells us that we don't fight a battle of flesh and blood. We fight a battle of the principalities. And this enemy wants to thwart God's plan that he has for our life. And so he wants to, what he's going to do is often bring pain, trauma, hardship, suffering into our life so that he can get us stuck and to stifle the plan that God has for our life. God's not to blame for our pain. That's one of the first places that we go is blame God. We have to recognize there are other people to blame or other things to blame for our pain, one of which are other people, right? There's sinful choices that encroach on our life. The other one is my own sinful choices. Sometimes I'm carrying pain that is consequences of something that I've done wrong. There are times that it's just because we live in a fallen and broken world. And I don't think I have to convince anybody of this, but like we all see the world is falling apart. There's famine, there's disease, natural disaster. There's so we need a savior that's other than this world to save us from this unraveling of the world. And then we have spiritual attack. Those are the four perpetrators of pain in our life. And God's not one of those. He's not to blame. So I had to recognize this is a spiritual thing. And the only way I'm going to take back territory in the spiritual that has been stolen from me is to take the battle into the spiritual. And that's part of what going back to preaching was for me.
I've like, so one of the things, so the last year, I've been in counseling again, because, there's moments that I also think that people need to realize that healing can be layered. Sometimes you have to consistently look at it. I grew up in abuse. I actually just recently found out in the last few months that the abuse was not started at 13. It started at 2. The first record of a reported abuse was 2 years old.
Goodness.
And I there was this moment around Easter where I heard for the very first time in years, heard God say unsinged. And I'm like, that's not even a word. So I was like, but the Lord can, he's the Lord, he can make words. And we were talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in church, and we're doing like a devotion for we do Lent at our church. And the thing was, like, when they pulled Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of the fire, they said like there's nothing on them. They don't even smell like the smoke. Their clothes they're not touched.
Yep.
And I felt God whisper like, Danisha, unhinged or unsinged, not unhinged. Unhinged is different, but unsinged. and I said unhinged to my husband, and he's like, what? Like, God told you you're unhinged? And I was like, well, look, I don't know.
Maybe he felt validated in that.
Maybe God's like, well, look at you.
I've known that for a while, Danisha. No, just kidding.
Yeah, I know. I was like, he's like, well, we got to talk about this. But it was unsinged, and it was like, I'm making it to where you don't smell like your story.
It's great.
And I sat back and I was like, oh my gosh. But then when I found the file at 2, it was Satan's been trying to take you out.
Yep.
And Satan goes after children.
2.
And I keep thinking of like Weston when he was 15 months.
15 months.
So not even speaking much at this point. And Satan's I'm not just going to try to get Davey off guard. I'm going to also take Winston out.
Right.
And my heart's like, ooh, no, don't you dare. And you're like, we're going to punch back. And I'm like, because you punched back.
Yeah.
You're protecting spirit in the spiritual sense, protecting your family too. And that's where we don't really get to in grief sometimes, is that we sit kind of in that and we're just like, okay, God, like, I'm mad at you. And that's kind of where we stay for a very long time.
Yeah.
But we often have the different levels of timing of healing. And so that is something that because I've been really digging into that, I've like, wow, like, we know trauma can produce different things in our life. Sometimes it is addiction. Sometimes it's running toward things of the world. And then sometimes it's running away from just dealing and sitting and saying, you know what, today sucks. Today doesn't feel good. Or no, I don't want to talk about what I went through. And there, trauma-informed training, I think, is so important for churches to be in and really understand, because you don't always need someone to revisit their past, but just say, okay, what are you feeling right now?
Right.
So when you're walking with someone, and you know, whatever their thing is, you know, it doesn't matter if it was when they were 2 or when they were 30. It doesn't matter if it was a recent death or a death that happened 15 years ago. How would you first sit with someone and just listen? Because I think that's really where we struggle the most, is we are all good at talking. We're really good at it. But the listening, what are things when we can step in and say, okay, I'm not equipped to handle this. I need to point you into someone's direction, but I'm still listening to you. And then how do I listen well and not just be like, okay, thanks for sharing. Bye.
Yeah. Right.
So what would your advice be there?
Well, I think what's really important is to do just that, is to listen. So we've already kind of covered that. Like, let's not cover this up or whitewash it with pat answers or try to solve or resolve someone's pain. So in order to listen, the prerequisite of that is asking questions. So I think
what kind of questions would be better to ask than how are you feeling? How are you doing?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first one is how, you know, I mean, you're not going to show up and be like, how are you feeling? Right. But, you know, I think that that is a good follow-up question, because I think it's really helpful to try to elicit someone's processing. If you can get them to externalize what is internal, then they'll begin to kind of process through it themselves. I mean, this is by nature first line modalities of healing is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is literally just externalizing what's going on internally. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of scientific reasons. Like, it begins to untangle all of the mess that's inside of you that you can't quite make sense of, because as you begin to verbalize it, or as you begin to write it down, you begin to start making some sense of it. You begin to like throw out the things that are untrue. And because even just by saying something out loud, you're like, you know what? I see how that is. Like, that's not exactly true. Right. And you begin to hold on to the things that are true. And so, you know, in scripture, it's amazing that God gave Adam a purpose in the garden, and the purpose was to have dominion over the earth. When he told Adam and Eve, have dominion over the earth and multiply. Well, the first way that they exercised dominion was to name the animals. So what's beautiful about that and applicable to us is, as you're experiencing emotions, those emotions can feel like they have dominion over you. They can feel very overwhelming until you begin to name those emotions.
Yeah.
And then when you give them a name that's broader than just like the typical
Angry,
5
sad, mad,
vocabulary words that we have,
happy.
mad, sad, right? But if you like maybe even use a tool like a feelings wheel, we do this in the Pain to Purpose course with people, and begin to broaden that and try to really narrow down, what is it that I'm feeling and why? And then if you ask yourself 7 why questions, so this is an exercise you can do with someone else. Ask them 7 why questions. Why? Well, why? Well, why? Right? Tell me more about that. You'll start to get someone unraveling and untangling the stuff that's going on there. And then when you reflect back to them, so when you go, hey, here's what I'm hearing you say, and, you know, you kind of rephrase what they've said in a way that they feel validated. They're like, yes, like, you see me. I think one of the reasons we feel uncomfortable in those kinds of settings is because we're afraid that they're going to get stuck there. Right. So we're afraid they're going to wallow. My counselor told me, Dave, you have to weep well without wallowing. So there is a tension, right? We don't want to get stuck there. But I've found more often than not, the people that are stuck are the ones that were never validated in their pain, and the ones that never actually weep well. They just like whitewash their pain and they diminish it, and they like pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And they ironically are the ones that get stuck.
Yeah.
But the ones who actually weep well, who go through lament, who actually grieve, who begin to process and untangle these things, and they begin to form a trauma narrative that begins to make sense, that's what now neurologically, psychologically, it begins to file away the incidences in our life in a way that we can construct a story, and we can put that story, we can lay over top of that story God's story of redemption, and we can go, oh, okay. You asked the question earlier. I mean, man, you're planting this church. You're in the middle of God's will. Like, how did you reconcile that? Right. Well, at first, that was a massive question for me. Hold on, God. Yeah. We packed up everything and left this convenient dream job to go and do this hard thing for you. We were in the center of your will. That's supposed to be the safest place to be. Well, that's a misnomer. I didn't realize that's a misnomer. I didn't realize that was a false belief, and that was an unspoken expectation I had of God until it happened. And then I got really angry and upset. And then God lovingly and kindly pointed me to all of these situations in scripture where the people who followed Jesus, the disciples, right, their lives ended horribly. Hebrews chapter 11 at the end of Hebrews 11, where it says that these men and women of faith, they walked into their death, right?
Yeah.
Some were sawn in two, it says. I mean, they horrible, deplorable acts being done to them by the Roman Empire. And yet it says the world was not worthy of them, and they counted it worth it to suffer for the cause of Christ. And so you start to peel that back and go, well, actually, you know what? That was a false belief that I had, you know, and so now I'm actually worshiping God for something that he does rather than for who he is. And when you start to peel that kind of stuff back, you start going, oh, actually, the real point of this life, as my counselor said, is not to make life easy. The real fight is to live well in a difficult world.
Yeah.
And that within there, that there can be meaning, there can be purpose. And so the only way you get to that, the only way you begin to have a right perspective and to begin to see through the right narrative of history, of scripture, of our lives, is by grieving and wrestling in those spaces.
I love that. And I think it's really funny because I'm thinking through all the situations that I've ever been in where I was told, like, don't ask me how I'm doing. And it really is that there's moments where we're not ready to go there.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really why people don't like that question. But also on the receiving end, and I remember a friend, I asked her, I was like, how are you doing? Knowing it was a hard season, I said, how are you doing? And she goes, do you want the real answer or do you want the church answer? And I said, I want the real answer. And she's like, horrible, dude. And I've been there where I'm like sitting with someone. I'm like, do you want the real answer or do you want like,
are you
hey,
ready
bye,
to
see you
sit
later?
here with me? Because I'm gonna open up a can of worms if you really want the
I was
real
like, look,
answer.
if you really want to know. And someone told me, they're like, you know, you don't need to say everything. And I was like, no, I do because you asked and said you wanted real. And those were the seasons of when I was able to really be real with people within my grief. And like, when I took in my siblings, it felt like I was still on the worship team. I told the new worship pastor at that point, like, hey, like, I understand if you want me to step down, but I'd prefer not to. I find that would be the worst thing for me, is to say you cannot be on the team because you're going through life. And he's like, nah, like, there's no reason to have you step down. Like, but if you need a break, if you need a Sunday off, just let me know. I'll help you. And I was like, cool. But I still leaned into ministry, and I was very real and raw with the girls I was youth leading at that time. And I just said, like, one time I was like, life just sucks. And what I found was, even though I had walked with those girls for 7 years, this was the first time that everyone went real deep. And it wasn't like, hey, we're just spewing out trauma, but we started really wrestling, like, okay, why does God allow this? And it was that moment that we sat as a group, and it was like 15 all of a sudden. We went from 4 girls to 15 girls. And it was all of us were being able to really talk about it and say, like, if this is the Jesus thing, like, if this is what our life is going to look like with the Jesus thing, is that what we want?
Yeah.
And I know, I think, I forget who, there's a speaker who has said it, where I think it's Nora Jones who said it, but she asked a question. She said, if Jesus is all that you get in this life, is that enough for you? And that has stuck with me.
Yeah.
And then you interviewed Beth Moore, and she said, it's not worth it, but it matters to God.
That's right.
Everything we go through. And that has changed how I look at everything. Cause I'm like, no, when people are, well, hey, Danisha, your life, you know, you have PhD, you're speaking of events and was it worth it? And I'm like, no. And so when I heard that, I was like, yeah, go Beth.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
no, what's going to make
true.
it worth it is one day when we step into glory, and scripture promises to us that this light and momentary affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory that far outweighs the former. So that's when we're going to have this moment where we go, okay, wow, all this stuff here on earth, no,
but
we trade it all in a heartbeat.
That presence of God is when we say, okay,
that's our reward.
This was worth it.
That's our prize. That's right. It's him
with you. And that, to me, like, okay, God, like, I had to get to because I kept looking for answers in my file, kept looking, and I'm sure there was moments that you had with this too, like looking for answers to why things happened with Amanda and why things happened to you. And there was this moment where I was looking for an answer and I didn't get it. And I was like, okay, Lord, that has to be enough that you know the answer. And I'm gonna trust you and know that on this side of earth, I'm not getting that answer here. But you already know it. And
right.
that's another level of healing, because it allowed me to stop being like in control and just go,
Yeah.
okay, God, like I don't know the details. And I keep thinking of, you had said something where it was like, okay, I can't, I'm angry, but it's not God didn't do it, but this is
Yeah.
something that he's asking me to sit in. How did you deal with anger towards the person who
Yeah.
broke into your home? What was that like? How did you, if you did, like what did you work through with that, or how do you advise others to work through the anger toward the person who
Mm-hmm.
did it? Because I think we can shift that and be like,
For sure.
and there's moments where I've seen people be like, their family members are murdered and they forgive that, and I'm like, I don't know how you got there, but
Yeah.
it's like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I was extremely angry. I didn't deal with it until the arrests were made.
Mm-hmm.
And then I saw their faces. There were three men, one of which was a shooter. Eventually, down the track, the other two took plea agreements to testify against the shooter. So they were accomplices in it. But when I saw their three faces, I became very angry, very vengeful. It was a very dark, dark place to be.
Right. Yeah.
The probably week 2 to week 6, 7, 8, something like that in the aftermath was the darkest place I'd ever felt in my entire life. And I don't say probably that I mean probably in that span, but it was absolutely whatever that span was, absolutely the darkest
like,
place I've
that
ever
was
been
there.
in my life.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, waking up with nightmares, cold sweats, didn't want to live. It was awful, and I was starting to fantasize about what I would do to these men if there was a protective nature in me, and then I felt guilty for not having fulfilled a role in my wife's life of being a protector. And so, man, I was like, it took me to a really dark place for a little while. And then I started realizing how dark it was. I started realizing that I knew the right answers, Danisha. I knew what I was supposed to do. I'd preached messages on forgiveness up to this. I'd said things like, hey, if you've experienced the radical forgiveness of Jesus, it's a spiritual impossibility to experience it and not be willing to extend it as well. But now I was being confronted with that truth. Do I really believe what I say what I say I believe?
Right.
And James, the brother of Jesus, says it's trials that test the genuineness of our faith. So is this faith genuine? Well, we don't know it's genuine until it's tested. And in that moment, it was tested. And so what I began to realize, and again, it's through lots of different conversations and different kind of like Holy Spirit moments, is that this was going to hanging on to this bitterness was only going to hurt me and the people I love around me. It was going to ooze out of me in ways that were sideways. And it was going to affect the way I show up in the world. It was going to affect the way I show up for Weston. It was going to affect everything, right? We all know bitter people who've just held on to resentment. Actually, there are studies now that are coming out scientifically that there's cancer related to resentment. There is all kinds of maladies within the body, illnesses, chronic illnesses related to bitterness. So when people say it's a cancer to the soul, it really is true. Bitterness rots the hand that holds it. So forgiveness is actually more of a selfish thing, to be honest with you. It's more of a self-care thing in a lot of ways. And it is only possible, I believe, by experiencing the radical forgiveness of Jesus. One of the things that I realized was that the root issue, the heart root issue that exists in those men that ended up growing into this full-fledged, action of taking Amanda's life, that same heart root issue lives in me. And that is the root issue that Jesus went to the cross for. So Jesus was murdered for my sin.
Yeah.
And it was the greatest injustice of all time. Amanda was an amazing woman, but she'll tell you she was not perfect. Jesus is the only perfect person that has ever walked this earth. And he was killed a criminal's death. He was murdered on the cross for me.
Yeah.
That reality is a sobering reality. When you really embrace that reality and you go, okay, you know what, man, I've experienced from the cross. Jesus said, Father, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
So that really led me down the track of going, I've got to choose to forgive. I can't wait till I feel it. I've got to choose to forgive. And I got to walk in that forgiveness every single day. Wake up every day going, I choose to walk in this. Right. And then eventually what happens is you begin to form, you kind of slowly go down that spectrum of like choice to feeling. And somewhere scattered in there is empathy, compassion, grace, right? Where you begin to go, these are all these things that God did for me. And he's called me to be an agent of reconciliation in this world. And as I began to learn these, I mean, they were boys, essentially 18, 21, 25. These young men, I began to learn their stories and just begin to kind of peel some of that back in some of the conversations I outline in the book. it did give me, on some level, I know this sounds really weird, a sense of compassion and empathy toward
Yeah.
them. Not for, of course, right? Like not for what they've done, but just going, man,
Who they're at
if it
their
were not for the
core.
grace of God, ergo I, right? Like I've been given so many opportunities, born in a different context and a different, right? Like, so
Right.
I'm not in fight or flight survival mode all the time
Yeah.
like they are.
Right.
And
Right.
so it doesn't excuse what they've done.
Right.
But what it did is, as I've chosen to walk in forgiveness, it released me from saying, I hold you accountable to this. And what that did is actually caused me to go, okay, God, I trust you to hold them accountable to this.
Yeah.
You're a better avenger. You're a better arbiter and judge than I am. And so you're going to set this right, God. And that's what forgiveness is, truthfully. It's trusting God with that and saying, you can handle this.
It's so hard because I think where I have been in the past where I'm like, I don't want to forgive, what I felt that I was doing was I was excusing their behavior.
Yeah.
And I was saying, okay, now we're good. Like, we're going to have a friendship, a relationship, and like, you're going to get out scot-free. And it's like, no. Like, my parents, like, they chose to do what they did. These boys chose to do what they did. There's consequences because of that. But then at the core, learning through like how trauma impacts somebody so horribly, long-term effects and all that stuff where it's like, wow, like I could get there too, but also at the same time, you start to look at the little child that's in them that says, where did no one look at you and say, hey, I see you? And that's what you're talking about, is you're seeing them and going, I am so sorry you were missed.
Right.
There is the consequence still for what they did.
Absolutely.
But I don't have to look at you and be like, I'm going to get you. And again, it's between like, look, what happens to you, how this outcome comes out, that's between you and God. That's between, God's going to take that with where he wants to go with that. But our job is to look you in the eye and say, I hope that you get to see who Jesus is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not in a vengeful way. Like,
that's
just
right.
like, I hope that he can help heal the inner part of you that needs Jesus. And that's a hard place to get in.
Danisha.
It's a hard place
to
get in.
To get to.
But it needs to be said.
It comes from like beginning to understand kind of a lot more about you and yourself, right? And as you begin to understand yourself, you begin to love other people, right? The scripture even says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. So you begin to start having empathy for yourself and going, oh man, I mean, there were things about this whole thing that happened where I was tempted to, and I could see very easily how people would do things that I never would have imagined that I would do because of the pain and the grief that I was experiencing. So it did give me some empathy to go, okay, I can see how people just, their life goes off the rails because of something like this and the pain that they've experienced. And that's, what you outlined right there. I actually include a letter that I wrote to one of the perpetrators of Amanda's murder. I wrote letters to all three of them, very distinct letters, but essentially each one followed a similar pattern that said, on this day, you chose to partner with a monster inside, really the enemy, right? There's a monster that has been growing inside of you. You chose to partner with that monster on this day. And what my hope and my prayer is that from this day forward, you choose not to. You give that monster the eviction notice. You let Jesus come in and take over your life, and you actually be transformed so that you can help to transform other people. And that is, I don't know where they're going to be in 10 years. I don't know where they're going to be in 20 years in terms of their walk, their soul, their spirituality, anything like that. But that is really where all of this path leads, is going, understanding that they're the child self in them. That's not what they would have desired when they were 5 years old. Right. And so, I think it's really important to just recognize those things when it comes to our perpetration. And what's really beautiful about it is you aren't diminishing people's, you're not like absolving them of the consequences or the gravity of their action by forgiving them.
Right.
In fact, real forgiveness necessitates that you acknowledge the gravity of their action, right? So our relationship with Jesus, the forgiveness that we receive, Romans tells us, for the wages of sin is death. That is a grave consequence, okay? What we have done has separated us from God. Who we are, even, we're sinful from birth. We have a sin proclivity. We are cursed by the sin nature. We deserve death. That's the wages of it. It says, but the gift of God is eternal life. And a gift is something that you don't deserve and you can't earn.
Yeah.
So what we're doing when we're forgiving people is we're giving them a gift that they don't deserve and they can't earn, but we're not diminishing what they've done to us.
Yeah. I think this, like, there's a lot of people who I've talked to who says, you know, do you ever wonder about the what ifs? And I said, well, I used to, like, what if this happened? What if that happened? And it got to a point where someone said, Danisha, you have to get over the what ifs and recognize the what is so that you can get to the now what.
It's really good.
And that I have told everybody, I was a high school teacher who was just like, look, this is what your life is, but what are you going to do with it? And I'm like, that I think is where grief is so hard, is that we do think about, like, it should have gone this way. It could have gone that way. What if it happened this way instead? And it makes us sit in this is what it is, but now what? So when this is kind of shifted pretty drastically in our conversation, but I think I want to step into it now, is how, you know, you eventually remarried, you eventually now you guys have more kids, and like that shift to how do you handle that aspect of like stepping back into love? Because I know a lot of parents who are experiencing this, is like, how do I step into this, not replace who I lost,
right,
but also honor who I lost? And how does a spouse honor in that when there is extra grief? Because that's a whole new level, is when you bring someone else in, and it's a new area of healing, to say, okay, I'm going to trust that this is good, and that this is not going to happen again. Because that's where, you know, that's actually where we heal the most, is when we're back into similar situations, and being in, you know, relationships with people is to grow more. So how does that work for someone who's experienced grief on your level?
Well, it does require a lot of grace on both fronts, right? And it requires a lot of courage. I think when you have experienced loss, you know, you're going to guard your heart. You're going to callous up. Naturally, that's going to be your proclivity, because you don't want to experience that same kind of, that level of loss again, that level of pain and hurt.
Yeah.
When you open your heart up to somebody, I mean, you've heard the old saying, right? It's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And honestly, you kind of go, I don't know about that, right? Because it's really painful to have loved at that level and to have lost, and especially in, you know, really in any way, but like, and in such a sudden way, and not be able to say goodbye. Like, that was just excruciating. It just feels like such a severing.
Yeah.
And so over the course of grieving, in the, you know, and you read about a conversation I had with my counselor, one of the things that I had to learn was, once again, how to become a whole person, you know, because now I felt like half of a person.
Yeah.
So in every season of our life, we have to learn how to become a whole person. We have a personhood in and of ourselves, right? We have, even if you're married, or like, we are whole. Like, I'm going to stand in front of Jesus, just me, one day, right? Like, it's not going to be, I'm not going to be able to look at anybody else or blame anybody else for where I'm at. I'm going to be, it's going to be me and Jesus. So I had to learn a new season of being content, where the reality of my life became what you said earlier. Like, okay, if I only have Jesus, I've got everything I need. Right. And so what that did is that began to restore me and put the pieces of my broken heart back together. And if you do that, if you're following Jesus in that space, then what will happen is your heart will become tender and your skin will become tough. So what takes place often in trauma is when people get calloused or bitter, their heart becomes tough, right? They're no longer going to be vulnerable. They're going to guard it and protect it at all costs. And their skin becomes tender. They literally recoil on anything that touches them, right? So they're very sensitive, because everything reminds them of their pain. But healing does the opposite. Healing opens your heart up again to love, to risk again. And so, you know, I got to that place where it was like, I think I'm ready to risk again. I don't know. Now, you never really are ready until you actually do it.
Right.
And then then you increasingly you know, have to decide to risk again and again.
Yeah.
But, you know, and Christy's such an amazing woman, because I always say it this way, you know, she doesn't live in anybody's shadow, because she shines her own light. And when I was poking my head up and going, okay, God, if you bring me another wife, I prayed 4 things. I said, would you make sure that she loves you more than she loves me? Because that's the most important quality that she can have. That's what I admired the most about Amanda, that you were her first love, Jesus, not me. She wasn't codependent on me. She didn't need me. Like, I was going to disappoint her. She knew that. Like, Jesus was her savior. but she loved me. So second, could you make sure she loves me? Like that would be nice too.
Like up
Third,
there,
could
but
she,
not the first
yeah,
thing.
yeah, could she love Weston as if he were her own? And then could she love
Yeah.
Amanda? And that's what felt impossible to me, because
Yeah.
I was just terrified of like, oh, there's going to be comparison. There's going to be jealousy. I'm not going to be able to open up. Here's 10 years of my life that I have with Amanda, both from
Yeah.
dating and from marriage. And that was a third of my life at the time. I was 30 years old when this happened. So how am I going to be able to disclose a third of my life to this other person and her feel confident enough in who she is in Christ that she wasn't going to feel jealousy or comparison or anything like that? So I thought there'd be some kind of a wall or distance between us in whatever this next relationship was. And the beautiful thing is Christy came in, and I think because she came in with her own pain, we just kind of cut to the chase. There was no like fluff on the beginning. It wasn't shallow. It was super deep. We both understood what pain was like. And as she became vulnerable and I became vulnerable, it was like there was something that happened right there. And it was way beyond like what people say trauma bonding or whatever, right? It was like there was something
cards
spiritual
on the table,
and supernatural.
Man. Just all the cards on the table. Yeah.
And what we found, what was interesting is as we threw those cards on the table, they looked like broken pieces, but they actually were puzzle pieces to fit together to a beautiful story. And a story that only God can write, you know. And 100%. So the last 2 chapters of Nothing Is Wasted, I write about some of that stuff and some of the crazy ways that Christy was connected to our story that only God could do, that helped us understand that God was in this, that she has her own assignment and calling within this. And they consider it now, like I say, I believe that Amanda one day in heaven will consider it, right? But
it was
Christy and I consider it, as like Amanda passing the baton to Christy. They were both runners. Amanda ran cross country. Christy ran cross country D1 in college. So I see them like passing the baton to each other in that way. And and we're living out like the next chapter of a beautiful story.
Yeah.
And I think that's so kingdom.
That is very,
I was grateful. I read a book about missionaries who on the front lines of the mission field experienced tragedy. And that also helped to color what I was going through. Like it helped me to go, oh, this is normal. People on the front lines, like doing extreme kingdom work over here. Yeah. They experienced tragedy. So you had these 2 couples and each lost their spouse, right? The opposite. And so then these 2 end up getting together and they write about it in this book about how they dream one day that they'll all 4 be sitting around and sharing together what God did in their lifetime. And then there'll be this like beautiful unity and harmony that happens there, with no jealousy, with no comparison, but just like basking in the glory of what God, his faithfulness and what he did in their lives. Yeah. And that just helped, like, that was a salve to my soul. It was like,
you needed
that's
it.
kingdom,
you're like,
you know?
And I think it's hard because it's like, I'm thinking of like where I came from and being in foster care and being like, well, my parents didn't pass the baton, you know, they just kind of dropped it. And we're just like, peace out. And I'm like, whoa, what's happening? And there are so many people, I think, who experience that type of brokenness where it's the person just drops the baton. They're like, I'm out. Sorry, I'm not on this race anymore. But there is still that kingdom work that God still picked up the baton and said, like, look, I still have you, even when that didn't work out. And that I think has been so, like, just sitting in that right now. I'm like, okay, God, I see you. Like, okay, people dropped the baton, but you didn't, because God always brought that extra person in my life to be like, hey, I'm going to bring someone in to love you in this moment. I'm going to bring in a parent figure that you need, a word of wisdom, a song, a Bible verse, hope, you know? And it's like, if you are listening and you're struggling, you're like, well, God's not bringing someone to help pass that baton. Someone just dropped it and said, I don't see you anymore. God still does. And that is such a beautiful kingdom thing to say, like, look, God, on this side of things, it's not right, but God is going to make it right one day. And that's the hope that we have in heaven. And that's the hope that we have as Christians. But I think that's also where it's a different type of processing that we're going to have to do when it comes to that. Do you have anything else to add before we end?
Well, I think just to add to what you're saying, I love that picture of God picking up the baton, because really at the end of the day, he is the only one that's never going to disappoint us, and he's never going to drop the baton. And I also think at the same time, like, if we're thinking about how to be safe people for others who we know have been hurt, you know, then how do we pick up the baton for others as well? Yes. You know, how do we be a safe person? And of course we'll drop it, but how do we not walk off the track like your parents did after they dropped? Like, how do we go, oh, I'm so sorry, I dropped that baton. I didn't handle that situation. Like, I didn't realize you were in, you know, a moment of dysregulation right there. And I'm sorry I reacted in that. I'm so sorry. You know, will you forgive me? let's hold space for this now. Let's talk to me about this. Tell me more.
Yeah.
What, so I think that especially when it comes to like, when we're talking about, relationships that are, a little bit more vulnerable with each other, more connected, more intimate, whether it's marriage or whether it's really good friendships or whatever it is, that where you're really opening your heart up, like how do we become a safe space to carry the baton for other people where others have dropped it? Which that's it can be kind of frustrating because you're like, I'm catching the back end of that you've experienced in the past.
Yeah.
But
my poor husband.
Yeah, but here's the thing, like I want to encourage those who are in that space, because truthfully, like we've all also lashed out at somebody that it had nothing to do with them, right? It had something to do with, so like we're guilty of the same thing. But if we're gonna, like, let me encourage the people who be a safe space for that and recognize like, hey, you know what, part of me walking with you as a friend is to pick up my cross and lay myself down for you and go, yeah, you know what? I realize that behind that, it's probably not just me. There's probably more behind that than what you're saying.
Right.
And I'm going to hold space for that. I'm going to care about you and love you anyways.
I do think you said something, pick up your cross and walk. And I think that that's super important because I think there are these moments when we're not healed, that we're looking for someone else to pick up the baton and run it for us or fix it for us. And that's not how healing works. It's not about someone doing it for us. It's sometimes we have to pick it up and just be like, look, this is where it's at right now. And it is okay to say, no, you don't get to pick up my baton. I'm going to still carry it and I'm going to work with this. But I think that we sometimes, like, I know for myself, like I'm thinking through like early 20s, mid 20s, where I'm like, someone love me, someone take it, someone help me, someone be there for me. And Jesus is like, I'm right here, man.
That's right.
I'm right here. And that's where, when we lean into him, we realize we don't need someone to carry it for us, but we need someone to go with us. And that's what we're looking for in relationships and friends, is for someone to go with us. And that's where you and Chrissy were able to come down and go, here's all my cards. I did that with my husband on our first time meeting and a date. I was like, look, here's all my cards, man. And he's like, hey, here's all my cards. And like,
cool.
Ever since then, 7 years ago, we were like, here's our stuff. And everyone's like, oh, you shouldn't have done that. And I'm like, no, it was time, because I never did that before. I waited 3-6 months. And then I was like, okay, here's my cards. Here's my baggage. And that always ended really poorly because people are like, oh, I don't want that. But I was just like, look, all cards on the table. I got 5 kids at home. They're not mine. They're my parents. Like I am baroque as a joke. Like, here's all the stuff. Here's the stuff I'm dealing with emotion. And that actually made us come to the table and say, like that same thing is like, I have my broken pieces and they actually fit together.
Yeah.
But we weren't looking at carrying each other. We were looking at saying, are you willing to walk with this and see what this looks like? Because that we can't fix it. We're not gonna, even if the puzzles fit together, we can't take it on. So
There's
I
no
want to
such
make
thing.
sure.
Sorry, Jerry Maguire, you don't complete me like that.
Oh, poor Jerry Maguire. He's like,
I wish, but at the end of the day, the only person that can is Jesus, right? So we're walking together. I love that metaphor. Yeah. I love that. Like, who's going to walk with me in this?
We need that. So if you guys want to pick up, first off, do you have anything else to add before I plug your book?
Oh, no, thank you so much. Yeah, this has been awesome. If anybody's, wants, there's more resources, nothingiswasted.com. We're not just a podcast. We're not just a book. There's so much there. We've got coaches, trauma certified coaches that can walk with you. We've got all kinds of content. We've got great community. Pain to Purpose, the course curriculum is amazing. So we'd love to connect
Nothing is Wasted is out. Please purchase it. I got through chapter 1 and I have to take it in chunks because it is a book where, because I know your story, it's not just a book anymore. It's oh my gosh, my friend, but also I get to see this side of the other side of you that I'm like, I know that there's hope, but man, that's hard to sit and to be like, here's the details, but also really excited to see who God gets to just shine light on and kind of give them that like light bulb of like, I'm here for you and we have a whole place for you. So pick up the book, look up Nothing is Wasted. There's all of those resources. Thank you so much, Davey, for joining. This was a great conversation. And if you guys have questions, you guys can reach out to him. You guys can leave comments. You can subscribe and follow along his journey anywhere and everywhere. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.